The Dark Ages, the misunderstood era that shaped modern Europe. The lights go out. Rome falls. Barbarians sweep across Europe. Knowledge is lost. Progress halts. For 1,000 years, the Western world descends into ignorance, superstition, and brutality. Or at least that's the story we've been told about the so-called Dark Ages. But what if almost everything you think you know about this period is wrong? Hello, history enthusiasts. Today we're diving into one of history's most misunderstood eras, the period often called the Dark Ages. Spanning roughly from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE to around 1000 CE, though some extend it to 1500, this millennium has been portrayed as a bleak interlude between classical antiquity and the Renaissance. But was it really so dark? The term Dark Ages itself has a revealing history. It was coined during the Renaissance by scholars like Petrarch, who were eager to contrast their own era of rebirth with what they saw as the cultural decline that preceded them. Later, during the Enlightenment, thinkers further emphasized this narrative to highlight their own intellectual achievements. But modern historians largely reject this simplistic view. Let's explore why and discover what the so-called Dark Ages were actually like. First, let's address the fall of Rome, often presented as a sudden, catastrophic collapse that plunged Europe into chaos. In reality, the Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. The western half declined gradually over centuries through a complex interplay of internal corruption, economic problems, climate change, pandemic disease, and yes, external pressure from various peoples often inaccurately lumped together as barbarians. These groups I carry, including Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others, weren't simply mindless destroyers. Many had interacted with Roman civilization for generations, served in Roman armies, and admired Roman culture. When they established kingdoms in former Roman territories, they often adopted Roman administrative practices, laws, and cultural elements. Take Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy from 493 to 526. Far from a barbarian destroyer, he maintained Roman institutions, protected Roman monuments, and employed Roman officials. Or consider Clovis, the Frankish king who converted to Christianity around 496 and laid the foundations for what would eventually become France. Which brings us to another misconception, that Christianity suppressed classical learning. While there were certainly tensions between Christian theology and pagan philosophy, many Christian scholars worked diligently to preserve classical texts. In Ireland, monks copied ancient manuscripts while creating stunning illuminated works like the Book of Kells. At monasteries across Europe, the copying of texts became sacred work. The preservation of knowledge wasn't limited to the Christian West. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived until 1453, maintained Greco-Roman traditions for nearly a millennium after Rome's fall. In Constantinople, classical texts were preserved, studied, and taught in an unbroken tradition. The Byzantine Empress Theodora, who rose from humble origins to become perhaps the most powerful woman in the empire's history, helped sponsor this scholarly tradition. Meanwhile, the Islamic world experienced a golden age during Europe's supposed dark period. Centers of learning in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba preserved and built upon Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science. Scholars like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, commented extensively on Aristotle. Muslim mathematicians developed algebra, the word comes from the Arabic al-Jabr, advanced astronomy, and preserved and built upon the mathematical knowledge of ancient Greece and India. The traditional Dark Ages narrative also ignores the significant technological advances made during this period. The heavy plow, horse collar, and three-field crop rotation revolutionized agriculture, allowing population growth that eventually supported the rise of medieval cities. Watermills and later windmills provided power for grinding grain and other industrial applications. These innovations may seem modest compared to modern technology, but they transformed daily life more profoundly than many Roman achievements. Politically, this period saw the seeds of modern European nations take root. Under Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800, much of Western Europe was briefly reunited. Though his empire fragmented after his death, it established patterns of governance and cultural exchange that would shape European development. Alfred the Great in England and other rulers began to create the centralized kingdoms that would eventually evolve into nation-states. Languages evolved too. Latin gradually transformed into the Romance languages: French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Germanic dialects developed into English, German, Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages. The vernacular literature that began to emerge late in this period formed the foundations of national literary traditions. Art and architecture flourished in distinctive, new forms. Byzantine mosaics achieved an ethereal beauty distinct from classical models. Islamic architectural and decorative styles developed their own sophisticated aesthetic. In Western Europe, Romanesque architecture emerged in the 10th century, characterized by rounded arches, thick walls, and stunning sculptural decoration. Even before the traditional end of the Dark Ages, we see the beginnings of the great Gothic cathedrals that would reach their height in the 12th and 13th centuries. These weren't just impressive religious buildings. They were complex engineering achievements that required sophisticated understanding of mathematics, materials, and structural principles. Education also evolved. Cathedral schools emerged in major cities, and by the end of the period, we see the beginnings of universities at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions would develop the scholastic method of inquiry that, while different from modern scientific approaches, represented a systematic attempt to reconcile faith, reason, and observation. So if this period wasn't simply a dark age of ignorance and regression, what was it? Modern historians generally prefer terms like early Middle Ages or early medieval period, recognizing it as a time of transformation and adaptation rather than simple decline. That's not to say life was easy. This was a time of significant challenges. The population of many former Roman cities declined dramatically. Trade networks contracted. Political instability was common. Climate fluctuations caused agricultural crises. And there were genuine losses of technical knowledge in certain fields. Perhaps most significantly, the period saw multiple waves of pandemic disease, including the Justinian plague in the 6th century that may have killed up to 25% of the population in affected areas. These demographic catastrophes had profound social and economic impacts. Literacy declined substantially among the general population, becoming largely limited to the clergy. This represents a real contraction of opportunity and access to knowledge. Yet even here, the picture is complex. Roman literacy had been largely limited to urban elites, and some historians argue that literacy may have been more widespread in certain early medieval communities than we've traditionally believed. Violence was certainly a reality, though perhaps not more so than during the Roman period. Raiders like the Vikings disrupted life in coastal and riverine communities across Europe from the late 8th century until around 1000. The Magyar invasions similarly affected Central Europe, while Muslim raids impacted Mediterranean coasts. Yet even these raiders eventually settled and integrated. Vikings became Normans in France, rulers in parts of Britain and Ireland, and established kingdoms in Russia. By the 10th century, Viking, Magyar, and Muslim raiders had largely either settled down or been defeated, contributing to the greater stability of the High Middle Ages that followed. What this complex picture reveals is not a homogeneous dark age, but a period of significant transformation. The centralized imperial model of Rome gave way to more localized forms of power and identity. New cultural syntheses emerged, blending Roman, Christian, and various indigenous European elements. Rather than a simple story of decline and fall, we see adaptation, evolution, and the laying of foundations for what would become modern Europe. This doesn't mean we should romanticize the period either. Life expectancy was short. Medical knowledge was limited. Social hierarchies were rigid. Women and marginalized groups faced severe restrictions. Religious conformity was increasingly enforced, sometimes violently. The period saw the beginnings of anti-Semitism as a systemic European problem. But complexity is the historian's friend and the oversimplifier's enemy. When we look closely at this period, we don't see an age of darkness, but rather a time of shadows and light, of setbacks and innovations, of loss and creation. Why does this matter? Because how we understand history shapes how we understand ourselves. The Dark Ages narrative implies that civilization is fragile, that knowledge and progress once lost can take centuries to recover. It suggests a teleological view of history as a story of advancement interrupted by mysterious regressions. A more nuanced view recognizes that human societies are always adapting to changing circumstances, finding new ways forward that build upon rather than simply recover the past. It helps us see that what looks like decline from one perspective might be transformation from another. It also reminds us that historical periods rarely break neatly at the dates we assign them. People living through the fall of Rome didn't know they were entering a new historical era. A peasant farming in the year 800 didn't think of themselves as living in the Dark Ages. They were simply living their life in the only time they knew. So the next time someone mentions the Dark Ages, perhaps gently suggest that the term itself might be a relic of outdated historical thinking. The years between 500 and 1000 CE weren't an aberration or a regression. They were centuries of real people facing real challenges, building communities, creating art, seeking knowledge, and laying the groundwork for the world we inhabit today. Their light may have burned differently than that of ancient Rome or Renaissance Florence, but it was never extinguished. And understanding its unique character helps illuminate not just the past, but our present and future as well. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a misunderstood era. If you enjoyed this exploration of the early Middle Ages, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning the simple stories and seeking the complex truths behind them.